I really liked Omaha. It was a size where I knew a lot of the people who mattered and what they did. So I wasn't lost in a great metropolis. And I was very fortunate in the nature of my parents' friends. And I was fortunate in that the public schools I attended were pretty remarkable by the standards of the time. And, of course, most of my schooling was in the Great Depression. But that means I'm one of the very few people that's still alive who deeply remembers the Great Depression. And that's been very helpful to me. It was so extreme that people like you have just no idea what the hell it was like. It was really, there was just nobody had any money. The rich people didn't have any money. People would come and beg for a meal at the door, and we had a hobo jungle not very far from my grandfather's house. And I was forbidden to walk through it, which meant I walked through it all the time. And I was safer in that hobo jungle in the depths of the 30s when people were starving practically than I am walking around my own neighborhood now in Los Angeles at night. The world has changed on that. You'd think the crime would be less, but the crime was pretty low in those days. So at any rate, I had a very unusual bunch of experience to go through civilization in various phases, including the greatest recession. Well, I say it's one of the greatest recessions in 600 years in the English-speaking world. It was really something, and it was very interesting to watch, and also to watch it fixed. It was fixed by the accidental Keynesianism of World War II. Very interesting. And Hitler had fixed the Great Depression in Germany by the deliberate Keynesianism, but he wasn't doing it to stimulate the economy. He wanted to get even with all the people he hated, but he borrowed all this money and created all these armaments. And Hitler's Germany by 1939 was the strongest economic power in Europe, and nobody else was close. So, and you wouldn't understand that as well as I do if you hadn't lived through it. You just could see the place gaining traction. More and more and more and more, and pretty soon it was fixed. In those days, there were all kinds of people, most of my family, for they believed in hard money based on gold and not much welfare and so on and so on. So that I was raised among fairly backward people by modern standards. But they were backward in kind of a self-reliant way that I think was helpful. I've never regretted that I wasn't raised in a more liberal establishment. I had a liberal aunt. She was really my mother's cousin, but she was the second lady dean at the University of Chicago, and she'd done her thesis on the conditions in the coal mines, and of course she was a screaming leftist. I would be a screaming leftist if I observed the way the coal miners of yesteryear were treated. You couldn't be a human being with any decency in you without feeling it was deeply improper to have the misery that great and have it manipulated for the benefit of the mine owners and so forth. But she sent me all these left-wing books, one every Christmas, and I always thought she was a little nuts. Which shows that if sometimes the very vivid extreme evidence misleads you on the deeper reality, you've got to be a guard on that, against that all your life. In fact, the whole trick in life is to get so that your own brain doesn't mislead you. And I have found that just a lifelong fun game. And I can't remember a time I wasn't doing it. I was not a prodigy or anything like that, but I was a prodigy in having adult interests. I was interested in what worked and what didn't and why. And I could see that very eminent people that I loved and revered were nuts in some ways, and I would decide, well, I certainly like Dr. Davis, but he's a little nutty in one way, and I'm not going to be like that. And so I was very judgmental, and I think that helped me. And also helped me that I kept changing my judgments as I learned more and more facts came in. And that created lifelong habits that were very, very useful. Another thing that I think really helped me is, particularly on my father's side of the family, my paternal grandfather was the only federal judge in Lincoln, Nebraska, the capital city of Nebraska. And he'd been there forever, and he stayed there forever after that. I think when he left, he was the longest serving federal judge in the country. And he was a brilliant man, and he'd risen from nothing. He was the child of two impoverished school teachers. And when he was raised in a little town in Nebraska, they'd give him a nickel to go buy the meat, and he'd go to the butcher shop, and he would buy the parts of the animal nobody else would eat. And that's what two school teachers lived on in those days. And the very indignity of it bothered him so much that he just determined to get out of poverty and never go back. And he did. He got ahead like Abe Lincoln, educated himself in lawyers' offices and so on. He had to leave college because he couldn't pay the tuition anymore. But he educated himself, and since he was utterly brilliant, it wasn't all that hard. And he had an attitude that was pretty damned extreme. And I would say his attitude was that you have a moral duty to make yourself as unignorant and as unstupid as you possibly can. And that it was pretty much your highest moral duty. Maybe taking care of your family came first, but in the ranks of moral obligations, quasi-religious, well, he was conventionally religious, so it may have been a religious duty to him. But he really believed that rationality was a moral duty, and he worked at it, and he scorned people who didn't do it. On the other hand, as a judge, he started with the idea that why would anybody rob a train or whatever, federal crime in those days. And he was pretty hard on people who did it. And I noticed as he got to be older and older and older, he was willing to call a man a good man on easier terms than he started out with. And I think that was a correct development in my... By the way, when he relaxed a little, he was still pretty tough.